They were abandoned by their own children, left to rot in a crumbling farmhouse where the phone never rang and the mailbox stayed empty. But when the ground beneath their feet began to collapse, what Harold and Margaret found buried beneath 78 years of silence would expose the cruelest truth about family and reveal a fortune worth $260 million. Before we dive into the story, make sure to smash subscribe, because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The morning sun crept slowly over the hills outside Millbrook, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that nobody in the old farmhouse seemed to notice anymore. Harold Mitchell, 78 years old with hands gnarled like tree roots from a lifetime of work, sat at the kitchen table staring at his coffee. The mug had a chip on the rim. It had been chipped for 3 years. Margaret, his wife of 54 years, hadn't said anything about it because they both knew there wasn't money for new mugs. There wasn't money for much of anything. The farmhouse groaned around them like it was in pain. The walls had once been white, bright and clean when they'd first moved in 42 years ago, with 3 children under the age of 10. Now the paint peeled in long strips, revealing grey wood beneath that had started to rot in places. The roof leaked in the upstairs bedroom during heavy rains. They'd stopped sleeping up there 2 winters ago. Now they slept in the den on a pull-out couch that hurt Harold's back, but was better than waking up to water dripping on their faces. Margaret stood at the sink, washing the same 2 plates they used every morning. She was 76. Thin in a way that spoke of skipped meals rather than health. Her grey hair pulled back in a bun that had become looser over the years as her fingers struggled with the arthritis. She looked out the window at the 12 acres that surrounded them. Once it had been beautiful. Now it was just overwhelming. The property taxes alone took 1/3 of Harold's pension. Social Security covered the rest of their bills if they were careful, if they ate simply, if nothing broke. But things kept breaking. Harold took another sip of coffee and glanced at the phone on the wall. It was an old rotary model from 1987. Still worked fine. The problem wasn't the phone. The problem was that it never rang, not with the voices they wanted to hear anyway. Telemarketers, sure. Robocalls about car warranties, but not their children. Daniel, their oldest, was 52 now. Lived in Boston, worked in finance, made more money in a year than Harold had made in his entire life. He called maybe 3 times a year. Christmas, Harold's birthday if he remembered, and once in summer when guilt apparently got the better of him. The calls lasted 7 minutes on average. Harold had started timing them without meaning to. Daniel always had a meeting to get to, a flight to catch, something urgent pulling him away. Rachel, their middle child, was 49. She lived in Seattle, ran her own marketing firm, posted constantly on social media about empowerment and authenticity and living your truth. Margaret had learned how to use the computer at the library just to see photos of her daughter. Rachel posted pictures of her garden, her yoga retreats, her book club, her weekend trips to wine country. She never posted about her parents. The last time she'd visited was 7 years ago for Harold's brother's funeral. She'd stayed 4 hours. Michael, the youngest at 46, was the one who hurt the most. He lived just 2 hours away in Claremont, close enough to visit, but he never did. He'd promised when he left for college that distance would never matter, that he'd always be there for them. For the first few years, he'd kept that promise. Then he got married, had kids, got divorced, got remarried. Life happened, he'd say. "I'm swamped, Dad. The kids have soccer. Jessica's parents are in town. Next month for sure." Next month never came. The last time all 3 children had been in the house together was at that funeral 7 years ago. Margaret had made a pot roast. She'd saved for 2 months to afford the good cut of meat. She'd wanted everything to be perfect, wanted to remind them what home felt like. They'd eaten quickly, phones buzzing on the table. Daniel left first, claiming an early flight. Rachel followed an hour later, hugging her mother with the kind of embrace that felt rehearsed. Michael had stayed longer, helped clean up, promised he'd come back soon. He never did. Margaret turned from the sink and looked at her husband. He'd gotten smaller somehow, shrinking into himself over the years. His shoulders curved forward now. He moved slowly, each step calculated to minimize the pain in his knees and hips. The doctors said it was severe arthritis, said there were treatments, medications, even a surgery that might help. But those things cost money they didn't have. Medicare covered some of it, but not enough. Never enough. The furnace had died last winter. They'd made it through February and March with space heaters and extra blankets, huddled together in the den while the pipes in the upstairs bathroom froze and burst. Harold had managed to fix the pipes himself with YouTube videos and supplies from the hardware store, but the water damage left stains on the ceiling that looked like storm clouds. The foundation had a crack running along the east side of the house. Harold had noticed it growing over the past 5 years, spreading like a scar across the concrete. He'd filled it with caulk twice, but it kept coming back, wider each time. He knew what it meant. The house was settling, sinking, slowly giving up, just like them. Margaret dried her hands on a dish towel that had been white once, maybe 20 years ago. Now it was grey with age and repeated washing. She folded it carefully and placed it on the counter. "I'm going to check the garden," she said softly. Harold nodded without looking up. The garden was Margaret's refuge. She'd planted tomatoes, squash, green beans, anything that might grow and save them a few dollars at the grocery store. She spent hours out there, hands in the soil, talking to the plants like they were the children who never called. She pulled on her mud-stained boots and stepped out the back door. The morning air was cool, carrying the scent of earth and growing things. The garden was modest, maybe 20 feet by 30 feet, surrounded by chicken wire to keep out the rabbits. She'd made it bigger this year, hoping to can enough vegetables to last through winter, hoping to stretch every dollar, every meal, every day. She knelt beside the tomato plants, checking for hornworms. Her knees protested, sharp pains shooting up her thighs. She ignored them. Pain was just another constant now, like the silence, like the empty rooms, like the photos on the walls that nobody in them seemed to remember. Inside the house, those photos covered nearly every surface. The mantel held framed pictures from birthday parties, Christmas mornings, summer days at the lake. Daniel at 7, gap-toothed and grinning, holding up a fish he'd caught. Rachel at 12, covered in mud from playing in the creek. Michael at 16, lanky and awkward in his prom tuxedo. There were wedding photos, grandchildren she barely knew, faces frozen in time. Margaret had dusted those frames every week for decades. Recently she'd started doing it less. What was the point? The people in those photos had become strangers. Or maybe she and Harold had become strangers to them. She wasn't sure which hurt more. Harold finished his coffee and stood slowly, gripping the edge of the table for support. His morning routine never changed. Coffee, then a walk around the property to check on things. It was habit more than necessity now. There wasn't much to check. The old barn was half collapsed, its roof caved in on the south side. The chicken coop had been empty for 3 years, since the last hen died and they couldn't afford to buy more. The tractor, a John Deere from 1976, sat rusting beside the barn, its tires flat, its engine seized. He pulled on his jacket, a canvas coat he'd owned since 1992, and stepped outside. The cold bit at his face. Autumn was settling in, bringing with it the promise of another winter they'd have to survive. He walked slowly, each step deliberate, following the worn path that circled the property. The land had been beautiful once, 12 acres of rolling hills dotted with oak trees and wild blackberry bushes. They'd bought it in 1982 for $38,000. It had seemed like a fortune then. Now it was worth maybe $200,000, but they'd never sell. Where would they go? This was home, even if home was falling apart around them. Harold made his way past the garden where Margaret knelt among the plants. He didn't disturb her. She needed those quiet moments. They both did. He continued toward the back of the property where the old root cellar sat partially underground. They'd used it for years to store potatoes, onions, canned goods. Now it mostly sat empty except for a few jars of preserves Margaret had made last summer. He was about 20 feet from the cellar when he noticed something wrong. The ground had settled. Not just settled, collapsed. There was a depression in the earth, maybe 6 feet across, forming a gentle crater that definitely hadn't been there yesterday. Harold stopped, his breath catching. His first thought was the septic system. If that had failed, the repair would cost thousands of dollars they absolutely did not have. He approached slowly, carefully testing the ground with each step. It felt solid enough around the edges. He knelt at the rim of the depression, his knees screaming in protest, and looked down. The earth had sunk maybe 2 feet in the center. He could see exposed tree roots, rocks, and something else. Timber, old timber, dark with age and moisture, running horizontally beneath the soil. Harold frowned. That didn't make sense. The root cellar was off to the left. Its structure was stone and concrete, built in the 1930s according to the property records. This timber was somewhere else entirely, somewhere deeper. He reached down and brushed away loose soil. The wood was solid, hand-hewn, fitted together with precision. This wasn't random debris. This was structure, intentional, built by someone who knew what they were doing. Harold sat back, his mind racing. He'd lived on this property for 42 years, walked every inch of it 1,000 times. How had he never known there was something beneath his feet? He looked back toward the house. Margaret was still in the garden, her back to him. He decided not to worry her yet. It was probably nothing. Probably just an old cistern or storm shelter from when the property was first settled. Nothing to panic about, but as he walked back to the house, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. Not just the ground, something deeper. Over the next 3 days, the depression grew. Harold watched it from the kitchen window, measuring its expansion with his eyes. By the second day, it was 8 feet across. By the third day, nearly 10. The earth was collapsing inward, revealing more of those timber beams. They formed what looked like a frame, like the outline of something buried. Margaret finally noticed on the 4th day. "Harold?" she called from the back door, her voice tight with worry. "What's happening to the ground?" He joined her on the porch, both of them staring at the growing crater. The morning sun cast long shadows across it, making it look even deeper than it was. "I don't know," he admitted. "Started last week. Keeps growing." Margaret's hand went to her throat. "Is it the foundation? Is the house sinking?" "No," Harold said, though he wasn't entirely sure. "It's too far from the house, maybe 30 yards out." "Should we call someone?" Harold was quiet. Call someone meant paying someone, an engineer, a contractor, someone who'd take one look and hand them a bill they couldn't pay. "Let me dig around it first," he said. "See what we're dealing with." Margaret looked at him with concern. "Harold, you can't be digging. Your back, your knees." "I'll be careful," he said, which they both knew meant he'd do it anyway. He started that afternoon with a shovel and a determination born from decades of fixing his own problems, because hiring someone had never been an option. The earth was soft from recent rains, giving way easily. He worked slowly, methodically, clearing soil from around the exposed timbers. By sunset, he'd uncovered more of the structure. The beams formed a rectangular frame, maybe 8 feet by 10 feet. They were joined at the corners with precise notches, the kind of joinery you didn't see in modern construction. This was old, really old, maybe early 1900s or even late 1800s. Margaret brought him water and watched from the edge of the excavation. "What do you think it is?" "Not sure yet," Harold said, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cool air. "But someone built this to last." He worked for an hour each morning and afternoon over the next week, careful not to push himself too hard. His body protested every shovelful of dirt, but curiosity drove him forward. Margaret helped when she could, carrying away buckets of soil, bringing him tools, standing watch as if they were uncovering something secret. In a way they were. By the 8th day, Harold had cleared enough earth to reveal what they'd found. It wasn't a cistern, it wasn't a storm shelter, it was a hatch. A heavy wooden hatch, maybe 4 feet square, fitted perfectly into the timber frame. Iron hinges ran along one side, black with age but intact. On the other side, an iron handle was bolted to the wood. Harold stood at the edge of the excavation, breathing hard, staring down at it. Margaret stood beside him, her hand gripping his arm. "That's a door," she whispered. "Yeah," Harold said. "A door to what?" He shook his head slowly. They both knew this property had been farmland since the 1880s. They knew the house had been built in 1926. They knew the root cellar was from the 30s. But this was something else entirely. "We should call someone," Margaret said again. "And tell them what?" Harold asked. "That we found a door in our backyard? What if it's nothing? What if we spend money on an engineer and it's just an old potato cellar?" Margaret bit her lip. Money. It always came back to money. "What if it's dangerous?" she asked. "What if the ground's unstable?" Harold looked at the hatch. The timber frame around it was solid. The beams showed no signs of rot despite being underground for God knows how long. Whoever built this had done it right. "I'll be careful," he said. That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She lay on the pull-out couch beside Harold, listening to his labored breathing. She kept thinking about the hatch, about what might be beneath it. Part of her was curious. Part of her was terrified. Mostly she was tired. Tired of being poor, tired of being forgotten, tired of living in a house that was falling apart one piece at a time. She thought about her children, wondered if they'd care about a mysterious hatch in their parents' backyard. Probably not. They'd probably tell her to call someone, to be careful, to not do anything reckless. Then they'd go back to their busy lives and forget about it within an hour. The phone sat silent on the wall. It had been 6 weeks since Michael's last call, 3 months since Rachel's. Daniel hadn't called since Harold's birthday in July. It was October now. Margaret closed her eyes and tried not to cry. She'd done enough of that over the years. Cried when the kids stopped coming home for holidays. Cried when they made excuses about why they couldn't visit. Cried when grandchildren grew up without knowing their grandparents. Cried when she realized they were alone in a way that had nothing to do with distance. Beside her, Harold stirred. "You awake?" he whispered. "Yeah. You thinking about it?" "Yeah." Silence stretched between them. Then Harold said quietly, "We could open it tomorrow. See what's down there." Margaret turned to look at him in the darkness. "You think we should?" "I think," Harold said slowly, "that this is our property. Whatever's down there, if anything, belongs to us, and I'm too old and too tired to wonder about it for the rest of my life." Margaret reached for his hand. His fingers were rough, calloused, the hands of a man who'd worked for everything he ever had. She squeezed gently. "Okay," she said, "tomorrow." The next morning dawned grey and cold. Harold woke before sunrise, his body protesting as he swung his legs off the couch. Margaret was already up, making coffee in the old percolator. Neither of them spoke much. They were both nervous in a way they couldn't quite name. After breakfast, they walked out to the excavation together. The hatch sat waiting, patient, keeping whatever secrets it held. Harold had brought tools, a crowbar, a hammer, a flashlight, work gloves. Margaret carried a rope, though neither of them was sure why. Harold lowered himself into the excavation carefully, his knees popping audibly. Margaret stayed at the edge, watching. He knelt beside the hatch and ran his hand over the wood. It was solid, surprisingly well preserved. Someone had sealed it carefully, the gaps filled with what looked like tar or pitch. He worked the crowbar under the edge of the hatch, testing it gently. The iron hinges groaned in protest, a sound like something waking from a very long sleep. Harold applied more pressure. The pitch seal cracked, breaking free in chunks. The hatch shifted slightly. "It's moving," he said, breathing hard. "Be careful," Margaret said for the 10th time that morning. Harold repositioned the crowbar and pulled harder. The hatch lifted an inch, then 2. Cold air rushed up from below, carrying a smell of earth and stone and something else. Something old. He got his fingers under the edge and pulled. The hinges shrieked. The hatch came up slowly, heavily, fighting him every inch. When it finally opened completely, falling back against its hinges with a deep thud, Harold and Margaret both stared down into darkness. The flashlight beam cut through the black, revealing stone steps. They descended steeply, disappearing into shadow. The walls on either side were also stone, fitted precisely, leading down into what looked like a corridor or tunnel. This wasn't a root cellar. This wasn't anything that should exist beneath their property. Harold looked up at Margaret. Her face was pale, her eyes wide. "There's a whole structure down there," he said quietly. "How is that possible?" Margaret whispered. "We've lived here 42 years. Harold shook his head. He didn't have an answer. He just knew that beneath the ground where they'd raised their children, beneath the property they'd walked 1,000 times, beneath the life they'd lived, there was something else, something hidden, something waiting. The stone steps were worn smooth in the center, as if many feet had walked them long ago. The walls glistened slightly with moisture. The air rising from below was cold and still. Harold tested the first step carefully. It held solid. He looked at Margaret. "I'm going down." "Harold, no. We should call someone. The police, the fire department, someone." "And tell them what? That we found stairs under our property?" He shook his head. "This is ours, Margaret. Whatever's down there, it's on our land. If there's something wrong, if it's dangerous, we'll call someone then. But I need to see first." Margaret wanted to argue, wanted to pull him back, keep him safe. But she knew that look in his eyes. He'd made up his mind. "Then I'm coming with you," she said. "Margaret, I'm not letting you go down there alone. We've done everything together for 54 years. We're not stopping now." Harold stared at his wife. Even after all these years, she could still surprise him. He nodded slowly. "Okay, but we go careful, we stay together." Margaret climbed down into the excavation beside him. Harold went first, one hand on the stone wall for balance, the flashlight in the other. Margaret followed close behind, her hand on his shoulder. They descended step by step into the darkness beneath their property, into a secret that had waited longer than either of them had been alive, into something that would change everything they thought they knew about the ground beneath their feet and the children who'd forgotten them. The stone steps descended 15 feet into the earth before opening into a corridor. Harold swept the flashlight beam across walls made of fitted stone blocks, each one carved and placed with precision. The ceiling was arched, supported by more of those hand-hewn timbers they'd found above. The air was cold and dry, surprisingly free of the musty smell Harold had expected. "This is impossible," Margaret whispered behind him. Her voice echoed slightly in the confined space. Harold didn't answer because she was right. This shouldn't exist. Nobody built elaborate underground structures on farmland in the middle of nowhere. Nobody except someone with something to hide. The corridor stretched ahead into darkness. Harold moved forward slowly, his free hand trailing along the stone wall. The surface was smooth, almost polished. Margaret stayed close behind him, so close he could hear her shallow breathing. After 20 feet, the corridor opened into a larger space. Harold stopped at the threshold and swept the flashlight in a wide arc. What he saw made his breath catch. It was a room, an actual underground room, maybe 15 feet square. The walls were the same fitted stone. The ceiling was supported by thick timber beams that showed no signs of rot, despite what had to be decades, maybe a century underground. But it wasn't the construction that shocked him. It was the contents. Furniture sat arranged as if someone had just stepped out. A heavy wooden table dominated the center of the room. 4 chairs surrounded it, their seats covered in leather that had cracked with age, but remained intact. Against one wall stood a cabinet, its doors closed. Oil lamps hung from iron hooks embedded in the stone walls. One still had oil in its base, though the wick had long since disintegrated. "Harold," Margaret breathed. "People lived down here." "Or worked," Harold said. He stepped into the room, his boots echoing on the stone floor. Dust covered everything in a thick blanket, undisturbed. Their footprints marked the floor like tracks in snow. He approached the cabinet and pulled open the doors. Inside were shelves lined with more oil lamps, boxes of matches sealed in tin containers, candles and supplies. Someone had stocked this place deliberately, methodically. Margaret moved to the table. A leather-bound book sat in the center, closed. She reached out, hesitated, then opened it carefully. The pages were yellowed but intact. Handwriting filled the first page in neat, careful script. "It's a ledger," she said, squinting in the flashlight beam. "Dates and numbers. Look, this one says January 5th, 1932. 1932. Harold tried to process that. They'd bought this property in 1982. That meant this place had been sealed and hidden for at least 50 years before they ever arrived. "What kind of numbers?" Harold asked, moving beside her. Margaret traced her finger down the columns. "Deliveries, maybe? It says received 12 cases, and then a price, and here delivered 8 cases to Henderson with another price." She looked up at Harold. "This looks like business records." Harold frowned. Business records from 1932, hidden underground in the middle of farmland. The pieces started clicking together in his mind. 1932 was deep in Prohibition, and this part of the country had been a major smuggling route for bootleggers running alcohol from Canada down to the cities. "I think," Harold said slowly, "we found a bootlegger's hideout." Margaret's eyes widened. She looked around the room with new understanding. "That's why it's so well built. That's why everything's hidden." Harold nodded. It made sense. Bootleggers had money, needed secure locations, and built sophisticated operations. This underground structure would have been perfect. Hidden, accessible, large enough to store significant quantities of illegal alcohol. "There's more," Margaret said, pointing to the far side of the room. "Another doorway." Harold turned. She was right. An arched opening led deeper into the structure. They crossed the room together and entered what appeared to be a second corridor. This one was shorter, maybe 10 feet long, and it branched into 2 more rooms. The first room was clearly storage. Empty wooden crates lined the walls, stacked floor to ceiling. Harold examined one closely. Faded lettering was still visible on the side. Canadian whiskey, distilled 1928. Another crate had similar markings for Scotch, another for rum. "They ran a lot of product through here," Harold said. The second room was smaller, more personal. A cot sat against one wall, its canvas surface sagging but intact. A small desk held more books and papers. A washstand with a ceramic basin and pitcher occupied one corner. Someone had spent significant time down here, maybe even lived here for periods. Margaret opened one of the books on the desk. "It's a journal," she said. Her voice had gone quiet, almost reverent. She began reading aloud. "November 3rd, 1933. Another successful run to Henderson's. Moving 20 cases tonight. The authorities are getting closer, but we've stayed ahead so far. The vault is nearly complete. Once it's finished, we'll have security for the operation's assets." She looked up at Harold. "Vault?" They both turned, looking deeper into the darkness. The corridor continued past this room. Harold felt his pulse quicken. They moved forward together, the flashlight beam cutting through shadow. The corridor made a sharp turn and ended at a wall. But this wall was different. In its center was a massive steel door, maybe 4 feet wide and 6 feet tall. It had a circular combination lock in the center, the kind you'd see on a bank vault. The steel was spotted with rust, moisture having worked on it for decades, but the door itself looked solid. Harold approached it slowly, almost afraid to touch it. He put his hand flat against the cold metal. This was real. This was serious. Someone had built a vault underground on property that would one day be his. "Can we open it?" Margaret asked. Harold examined the lock. The dial was frozen with rust and corrosion. He tried turning it. Nothing. He applied more pressure, and the dial shifted slightly, grinding against itself. He worked it back and forth, feeling it loosen incrementally. Rust flaked off, falling to the stone floor. "I don't know the combination," he said, "but even if I did, I'm not sure this lock still works." Margaret moved closer, studying the door. "Look," she said, pointing to scratches around the lock mechanism. "Someone tried to get in before. See those marks? Someone attempted to drill or pry it open." Harold looked. She was right. Crude tool marks scarred the steel around the lock, but whoever had tried hadn't succeeded. The vault remained sealed. "We need penetrating oil," Harold said, "and time. Maybe we can free up the mechanism enough to try combinations." They stood together in the cold corridor, staring at the vault door. Whatever was inside had been important enough to seal in steel, important enough to hide beneath the earth, important enough that someone had tried and failed to break in. "Should we try to open it?" Margaret asked quietly. Harold thought about their house falling apart above them, thought about the bills stacked on the kitchen counter, thought about children who never called and a life that had shrunk down to survival. Whatever was in this vault, it belonged to them now. It was on their property. It was their discovery. "Yeah," he said. "We try." They spent the rest of that day bringing supplies down into the underground structure. Harold descended and climbed those stone steps a dozen times, his knees screaming, but adrenaline pushed him forward. He brought penetrating oil, wire brushes, rags, more flashlights, a battery-powered lantern they'd gotten for emergencies. Margaret made sandwiches and brought down water and a thermos of coffee. By late afternoon, Harold had worked enough oil into the lock mechanism that the dial would turn. It still ground and caught, but it moved. The problem was the combination. He tried obvious sequences, 1, 2, 3, 4, 0, 0, 0, 0, birthdays and anniversaries. Nothing worked. "The journal," Margaret said suddenly. "Maybe there's a clue in the journal." They returned to the smaller room, and Margaret gathered all the papers and books. They carried everything to the first room, the one with the table, and spread it out under the lantern light. Harold sat in one of the old chairs, which creaked alarmingly but held his weight. Margaret sat beside him. They read for hours. The journals told the story of a man named Cornelius Thornton, though he referred to himself only as CT in most entries. He'd been a successful bootlegger operating throughout the late 1920s and early 1930s. He'd bought this farmland in 1927 specifically to build his underground operation. The house above, the one Harold and Margaret lived in now, had been his legitimate front. A farmer, as far as anyone knew. But beneath the farm, Cornelius had built an empire. The underground rooms had served as a distribution center. Trucks would arrive at night, unload in the barn, and the alcohol would be moved down through the hatch. From here, it was distributed to speaks and restaurants and private buyers throughout 3 counties. Cornelius had been careful, methodical, and apparently quite wealthy. His ledgers showed massive profits, and as prohibition wore on and enforcement intensified, he'd built the vault to protect his accumulated wealth. "Listen to this," Margaret said, reading from a journal entry dated August 9th, 1934. "The vault is my insurance. Everything I've earned, everything I've built, it's secured now. If they come for me, they'll find nothing. The farm will appear legitimate. The operation's assets are hidden where no one will find them. The combination is safe. Only I know it." Margaret looked up. He never wrote down the combination. Harold leaned back in the chair. But he died. Somehow, he must have died without telling anyone where this was or how to access it. They kept reading. The last entry was dated October 2nd, 1934. It was brief. Moving the final assets into the vault today. Tomorrow I leave for Chicago to finalize the Henderson deal. When I return, prohibition will be over and my fortune secured. That was it. No more entries. He never came back, Margaret said softly. Harold nodded. Must have died in Chicago, or gotten arrested, or killed. The property would have gone to the state or been sold for back taxes. No one knew about this underground structure. No one knew about the vault. Until now, Margaret whispered. They looked at each other in the lamplight. The weight of what they'd found settled over them like snow. Harold stood slowly, his body protesting. We keep trying. There has to be a way. Over the next 3 days, Harold worked on that lock. He tried every combination he could think of. Dates from the journals, prices from the ledgers. He tried sequences based on Cornelius Thornton's initials, his suspected birth year, anything. Margaret helped, reading through every scrap of paper, looking for clues. She found Cornelius's full name in a property deed tucked into one of the journals, Cornelius James Thornton, born March 3rd, 1891. Harold tried that. 331891. Nothing. He tried variations, reversed it, broke it into pieces. Nothing worked. On the 4th day, Margaret found something. It was tucked into the back of the main ledger, a single page that had been glued into the binding. A list of names and numbers. Harold, look at this, she said. He took the page. It appeared to be Cornelius's emergency contacts, associates probably, people he did business with. Beside each name was a number, but one entry was different. Vault access, it read. And beside it, 7 right 14, left 20, 8 right 7 left. Harold's hands started shaking. That's not a phone number, that's a combination. They practically ran to the vault. Harold's knees protested, but he ignored them. He stood in front of the steel door, Margaret beside him holding the lantern. He wiped his palms on his pants and gripped the dial. 7 right, he said, turning it carefully. The dial ground but moved. He counted 7 numbers clockwise, stopped. 14 left. He turned it counterclockwise. The mechanism clicked and caught. He felt something shift inside the lock. 28 right, clockwise again. Another click. His heart hammered. 7 left. Counterclockwise to 7. He stopped, holding his breath. For a moment, nothing happened. Then he heard it. A deep, solid clunk from inside the door, the sound of heavy bolts retracting. Harold, Margaret breathed. He grabbed the door's handle and pulled. The hinges shrieked, rust and corrosion fighting him. The door was heavy, hundreds of pounds of steel, but it moved. Slowly, grudgingly, it swung open. What happens next will reveal a fortune that had been buried for 90 years, expose the truth about everything Cornelius Thornton died protecting, and show Harold and Margaret that the ground beneath their feet had been hiding more than just memories. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. Cold air rushed out of the vault, carrying a smell of old paper and metal. Harold shined his flashlight inside, and both he and Margaret gasped. The vault was maybe 10 feet by 10 feet. Every wall had shelving built into the stone, and every shelf was full. Harold stepped inside first, Margaret right behind him. The flashlight beam swept across fortune. The first shelf held gold bars, actual gold bars, stacked in neat rows. Harold picked one up with shaking hands. It was heavy, maybe 20 pounds. He could see markings stamped into the metal. American Refining Company, 1 troy pound, .999 fine gold. There were at least 30 bars on just this one shelf. "Oh my God," Margaret whispered. "Harold, that's real gold." The next shelf held coins. Gold coins in plastic sleeves, organized by year and denomination. $20 gold pieces from the 1800s. $50 octagonal gold pieces. Rare mint errors, some with tags identifying them as extremely valuable. Another shelf was dedicated to currency. Not modern bills, but old ones. Silver certificates, gold certificates, large denomination notes, bundles of them, wrapped in paper bands. Some were marked as star notes or special editions. Margaret recognized them from a collector show she'd watched once. These weren't just old bills. They were rare, worth far more than their face value. Harold moved deeper into the vault. The back wall held what looked like official documents. He pulled one out carefully. It was a bearer bond, $50,000, issued in 1932. Another was for $100,000. There were dozens of them, maybe more, all issued in the early 1930s and never redeemed. Bearer bonds, Harold said, his voice shaking. Whoever holds them owns them. They're like cash. Margaret had moved to another shelf. This one held jewelry, pieces in velvet boxes and cloth bags. She opened one box and found a necklace dripping with diamonds. Another held a brooch with emeralds. There were rings, bracelets, watch chains, all from the Art Deco period, all valuable. Another section held art. Small paintings were carefully rolled and stored in protective cylinders. Harold opened one and carefully unrolled a canvas. It was maybe 12 inches by 16 inches, showing a street scene in Paris. The signature in the corner made his hands shake, Renoir. "Margaret," he said quietly, "I think this is a real Renoir." There were 5 more rolled paintings, 5 more potential masterpieces. Harold set down the painting and just stood there, trying to process what he was seeing. They'd stumbled into a fortune, not just a small windfall, a massive, life-changing, generation-altering fortune. Stamps. There was an entire section dedicated to rare stamps in archival books. Margaret flipped through one and saw stamps from the 1800s, some with printing errors, some from countries that no longer existed. Cornelius Thornton hadn't just been a successful bootlegger. He'd been a collector, an investor, someone who understood that wealth could be hidden in small, valuable items. And he'd squirreled away everything he'd earned into this vault. Harold sank down to sit on the stone floor, his back against the cold wall. Margaret sat beside him. They stared at the shelves in silence. "How much do you think this is worth?" Margaret finally asked. Harold shook his head slowly. "I don't know. The gold alone must be worth millions. Those bearer bonds, if they're still valid, could be worth millions more. The art, the jewelry, the stamps, the rare currency." He paused, overwhelmed. "This could be 50 million. It could be 100 million, maybe more." Margaret started to cry. Not sad tears, shocked tears, overwhelmed tears. Tears that came from decades of barely scraping by, of skipped meals and unpaid bills and a house falling apart, of children who never called and a future that looked like nothing but slow decline. And now this. Harold put his arm around her, and they sat together on the cold floor of a bootlegger's vault, surrounded by more wealth than either of them could comprehend. "What do we do?" Margaret asked, through her tears. Harold didn't answer right away. He was thinking about the gold bars, about those bearer bonds, about painting that might be worth millions, about the house above them with its leaking roof and cracked foundation, about the medical treatments he couldn't afford, about grandchildren growing up without knowing their grandparents. "We document everything," he said finally. "We photograph it. We make lists. Then we find a lawyer, a good one, someone who can tell us what our rights are, how to handle this legally." "Should we tell the children?" Margaret asked. Harold was quiet. He thought about Daniel in Boston, Rachel in Seattle, Michael just 2 hours away. None of them had called in weeks. None of them knew about their parents' struggles, or if they knew, they didn't care enough to help. "Not yet," he said. "Not until we know what we're dealing with." They spent the rest of that day in the vault. Margaret had brought down Harold's old camera, a digital one they'd bought back in 2008. It still worked. She photographed everything while Harold made lists in a notebook. Every gold bar, every coin, every bearer bond. They opened every jewelry box, unrolled every painting, catalogued every stamp collection. By the time they climbed back up those stone steps, evening had fallen. They emerged into their backyard exhausted, filthy, and forever changed. Inside the house, everything looked different. The chipped coffee mug, the worn furniture, the faded photos on the wall. It was still their life, still their home. But now there was something beneath it, something that changed everything. Margaret heated up soup for dinner. They ate in silence, both too overwhelmed to talk. After dinner, Harold called a lawyer in the next county. He'd found the name online, a firm that specialized in estate law and property disputes. He left a message asking for a consultation, something about a property discovery, nothing specific. They went to bed early, exhausted. Harold lay on the pull-out couch, staring at the ceiling. He kept thinking about the vault, about Cornelius Thornton, who died 90 years ago, never knowing his treasure would someday save a struggling elderly couple he'd never met. Beside him, Margaret stirred. "Harold? Yeah, I'm scared. Me too. What if someone tries to take it? What if the government says it's not really ours?" Harold reached for her hand. "Then we fight. We've got documentation. It's on our property. We'll find a way." They lay together in the darkness, holding hands like they had for 54 years, like they would until the end, whatever that end looked like now. The phone rang. Harold jerked upright, his heart pounding. The phone never rang this late. It was nearly 10 o'clock. Margaret sat up too, looking frightened. Harold got up and crossed to the wall phone. He picked up the receiver. "Hello? Dad?" It was Michael's voice. "Hey, sorry to call so late. I was just thinking about you guys and wanted to check in." Harold stood there, the receiver pressed to his ear, his mind reeling. Michael, calling out of nowhere, for the first time in 8 weeks, the same day they'd opened the vault. "Dad? You there?" "Yeah," Harold said slowly. "Yeah, I'm here." "Everything okay? You sound weird." Harold looked at Margaret. She was watching him, her face pale in the dim light. He thought about the vault beneath their feet, about the fortune it held, about the timing of this call. "Everything's fine," he said carefully. "Just surprised to hear from you. It's been a while." I know. Work's been crazy. But listen, I was thinking maybe I could drive up this weekend. Bring the kids. They haven't seen you guys in forever." Harold's grip tightened on the phone. Michael wanted to visit. After months of excuses, suddenly he wanted to visit. The coincidence felt impossible. "This weekend?" Harold asked. "Yeah, if that works. Or next weekend. Whatever's good for you." Harold closed his eyes. He didn't know what to say. Part of him wanted to see his son, his grandchildren. Part of him wondered why now. Why this week of all weeks? "Let me talk to your mother," Harold said. "I'll call you back." He hung up before Michael could respond. Margaret stood and came to him. What did he want? "To visit," Harold said. "This weekend." Margaret's expression shifted through emotions too complex to name: hope, suspicion, longing, doubt. "Do you think he knows?" she whispered. "How could he?" Harold asked. "We haven't told anyone. We just opened the vault today." But even as he said it, doubt crept in. Small towns had ears. People talked. Someone might have noticed their excavation, might have seen them going in and out of the hatch, might have mentioned it to someone else who mentioned it to someone else until somehow, some way, word reached their children. Or maybe it was just coincidence. Maybe Michael really was just thinking about them. Harold and Margaret stood together in their small kitchen, the phone silent on the wall, and realized that everything had just gotten a lot more complicated. They'd found a fortune, but they'd also found something else. Questions, suspicion, and the uncomfortable knowledge that after years of silence, Their children were suddenly interested in them again. The lawyer's office sat on the second floor of an old brick building in Clearwater, the next county over. Harold had driven past it 100 times without noticing. The sign outside read, "Patterson and Associates, Estate Law and Property Matters." It looked respectable enough, though the carpet in the waiting room was worn and the receptionist's desk had seen better decades. Harold and Margaret sat in matching chairs that squeaked when they shifted their weight. Margaret clutched a large envelope containing photographs and documents from the vault. Harold held his old notebook with his handwritten inventory. They'd debated bringing actual items from the vault but decided against it. Not yet. Not until they knew who to trust. A door opened and a man in his early 60s appeared. He was thin, grey-haired, wearing a suit that was pressed but not expensive. "Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell, I'm Thomas Patterson. Please come in." His office was cramped but organized. Law books lined floor-to-ceiling shelves. A desk buried under case files dominated the space. Patterson cleared 2 chairs and gestured for them to sit. "You mentioned a property discovery on the phone," he said, settling behind his desk. "Why don't you tell me what you found?" Harold and Margaret exchanged glances. Then Harold began. He explained about the ground settling, the excavation, the hatch. He described the underground structure, the rooms, the journals. Patterson listened without interrupting, his expression neutral. When Harold got to the vault, Patterson leaned forward slightly. When Harold described the contents, the lawyer's eyebrows rose. "You're telling me," Patterson said slowly, "that you found an underground bootlegger's vault containing gold, bearer bonds, art, and jewelry on your property that you've owned for 42 years. "Yes," Harold said. "And you want to know if it legally belongs to you?" "Yes." Patterson was quiet for a long moment. Then he stood and pulled a thick book from his shelf. He flipped through pages, read something, flipped more pages. Finally, he sat back down. "Treasure trove law," he said. "It varies by state, but generally speaking, if you find hidden property on land you own, it belongs to you. The key factors are whether it was intentionally hidden, whether the original owner can be identified, and whether there are surviving heirs with legitimate claims." "The original owner was Cornelius Thornton," Margaret said. "He died in 1934. We found records." Patterson made notes. "Surviving heirs?" "We don't know," Harold admitted. "The property changed hands multiple times before we bought it in 1982. We never heard the Thornton name until we found these journals." Patterson nodded. "That works in your favor. If there are no identifiable heirs who can prove direct lineage and claim, the treasure becomes part of the property, which you own." Harold felt something release in his chest. "So it's ours?" "Most likely," Patterson said. "But there are steps. You'll need to report the find to local authorities, primarily for tax purposes. The IRS will want to know about this. Any assets you liquidate will be subject to capital gains tax. If those bearer bonds are still valid, they'll be considered income." "How much tax?" Margaret asked quietly. "Depends on total value. Could be 30 to 40% of whatever you sell." Harold did the math in his head. If they had 100 million, 40% was 40 million. That left 60 million. Still more money than he could comprehend. But the numbers stung. "What do we do first?" Harold asked. Patterson pulled out a legal pad. "We establish a clear chain of title. I'll research the property's history, document every transfer from Thornton to you. We'll need professional appraisals of everything in that vault. I know people, experts who can authenticate the art, the coins, the jewelry. Then we file the appropriate paperwork with the state and federal authorities." "How long does that take?" Margaret asked. "Months," Patterson said honestly. "Maybe longer. These things move slowly. But in the meantime, my advice is to secure the site. Tell no one. The more people who know, the more complicated this becomes." Too late, Harold thought. Michael had already called. but he didn't mention that to Patterson. They spent another hour discussing details, signing a retainer agreement, authorizing Patterson to begin the legal work. When they finally left, Harold felt both relieved and anxious. They had a path forward, but it was a long path and they'd already started walking it without realizing how far it stretched. The drive home took 40 minutes. They rode in silence, both lost in thought. As Harold turned onto their long driveway, Margaret suddenly gripped his arm. "Harold, look!" A car was parked in front of their house, a newer sedan, silver, unfamiliar. As they pulled up, a man got out. He was maybe 50, dressed in khakis and a polo shirt, carrying a clipboard. Harold parked and got out slowly. "Can I help you?" The man smiled, friendly but professional. "Mr. Mitchell, I'm Gary Hendricks. I work for the county assessor's office. We had a report of unusual excavation on your property and wanted to follow up." Harold's stomach dropped. "Excavation?" "Yes, sir. Someone mentioned you'd been digging in your back field. Just want to make sure everything's up to code. No septic issues, nothing that might affect property values in the area." "Who reported it?" Harold asked, his voice harder than he intended. Hendricks consulted his clipboard. "Anonymous tip. Happens sometimes. Neighbors looking out for each other." He smiled again. "Mind if I take a look?" Harold wanted to refuse, wanted to send this man away, but refusing would raise more suspicion. "It's just some ground settling," he said. "We were checking the foundation." "Won't take but a minute," Hendricks said, already walking around the side of the house. Harold and Margaret followed. They rounded the corner and Harold's heart sank. The excavation was clearly visible, the dirt piled around it, the hatch lying open because they'd been too tired to close it last night after hauling up supplies. Hendricks walked to the edge and looked down. His expression changed, not suspicious anymore, confused. "That's not a septic issue," he said slowly. "What is that?" "Old root cellar," Harold said quickly. "From when the property was first settled. We found it by accident." Hendricks crouched at the edge, peering down at the stone steps. "That's some root cellar. Looks almost like a bunker or something." "Like I said, old," Harold repeated. "Probably from the 1880s. Hendricks made notes on his clipboard. "You planning to fill this in? Could be a safety hazard." "Eventually," Harold said, "once we're done exploring it." Hendricks stood and brushed dirt from his knees. "Well, as long as it's not affecting neighbors' properties or water tables, I suppose it's your business, but you might want to fence it off, liability and all." He handed Harold a business card. "Any other construction or major property changes, give us a call first. Save yourself some hassle." Harold took the card. They watched Hendricks get in his car and drive away. As soon as he was out of sight, Margaret turned to Harold. "Someone told them," she said. "Someone's been watching." Harold nodded grimly. "We need to close that hatch. Cover it up. Make it less obvious." They spent the next 2 hours doing exactly that. Harold's knees screamed as he climbed down and closed the heavy hatch from inside, then climbed back up. They spread the excavated dirt back over it, not enough to hide it completely, but enough to make it less prominent. Harold found some old plywood in the barn and covered the area, weighing it down with concrete blocks. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. That evening, Harold called Michael back. His son answered on the first ring. "Hey, Dad, I was hoping you'd call. So this weekend work?" Harold took a breath. "Actually, Michael, this isn't a great time. Your mother's not feeling well, and we've got some things we need to handle around the property." A pause. "Is Mum okay? What's wrong?" "Just tired," Harold said. It wasn't entirely a lie. Margaret was exhausted. They both were. "Maybe in a few weeks?" "Oh." Michael sounded disappointed. "Yeah, sure. Of course. Just let me know when things settle down." "We will," Harold said, and hung up before his son could ask more questions. Margaret was watching him from the kitchen doorway. "You think that was smart? Putting him off?" I think we need time to figure out what we're doing before we deal with them, Harold said. The next morning, Rachel called. Margaret answered the phone, surprised to hear her daughter's voice. They exchanged pleasantries for exactly 90 seconds before Rachel got to her point. So, Mum, I heard you guys have been doing some work on the property. Margaret's blood went cold. Where did you hear that? Oh, you know how these things spread. I have a friend in Clearwater whose sister lives in Millbrook. She mentioned the Mitchell place. Rachel's voice was casual, but there was something underneath it. So, what are you working on? Finally fixing up the house? Just some maintenance, Margaret said carefully. Must be expensive. You guys doing okay, financially? There it was, the real question. Margaret felt anger rise in her throat. Rachel hadn't asked about their finances in years, hadn't offered to help when the furnace died or the pipes burst. But now, suddenly, she was concerned about money. We're managing, Margaret said coolly. Well, if you need anything, you know you can ask. Michael and Daniel and we could help out. Maybe even come visit, see what needs doing. That's kind of you, Margaret said, her voice flat. But we're fine. After she hung up, she sat at the kitchen table with her head in her hands. Harold came in from feeding the chickens they no longer had, just an old habit. Rachel called, Margaret said, asking about work on the property. Harold sat down heavily. Michael last night, Rachel today. They know something, Margaret whispered. Somehow they know. By the end of the week, Daniel had called too. His approach was more direct. He claimed he was reviewing his investment portfolio and wondered if Harold and Margaret had considered selling the property, cashing out while land values were good, maybe moving somewhere with lower upkeep. Harold had listened to his oldest son, the one who'd barely called in a year, suddenly worried about their real estate decisions. He'd politely declined and hung up. But the pattern was clear. All three children, silent for months, suddenly interested, suddenly calling, suddenly concerned about their parents' property and finances. Someone had talked. Someone in Millbrook had seen something, heard something, and word had spread the way it always did in small towns. Whispers at the grocery store, conversations at the gas station, and somehow those whispers had reached Boston, Seattle, and Claremont. Patterson called on Friday with an update. He'd researched the property's title history. Cornelius Thornton had owned it from 1927 until his death in 1934. The property had been seized for back taxes in 1935 and sold at auction. It changed hands 4 more times before Harold and Margaret bought it in 1982. I found something interesting, Patterson said. Cornelius had a wife, Edith, who died in 1930. No children. His only surviving relative was a sister who moved to California in 1936. Her line died out in the 70s. No one to make a claim. So it's really ours, Harold said. Pending proper documentation and tax filing, yes. But Mr. Mitchell, you need to move carefully. Once you start liquidating assets, people will notice. Wealthy collectors, auction houses, they talk. You'll want to decide what you're keeping versus selling and how public you want this to be. Harold thanked him and hung up. He found Margaret in the garden, pulling weeds between tomato plants that had mostly finished producing for the season. Patterson says the property's clean, he told her. No competing claims. It's ours. Margaret sat back on her heels, looking up at him. Then why don't I feel relieved? That night, Harold couldn't sleep. He lay on the pull-out couch, listening to Margaret's breathing beside him and staring at the ceiling. Every creak of the old house made him tense. Every car that passed on the distant road made him wonder if someone was watching. Around 2 in the morning, he heard something. Not inside the house, outside. A soft, metallic sound, like someone trying a door handle. Harold sat up slowly, carefully. He'd kept his grandfather's old rifle in the hall closet for years, never had cause to use it. He retrieved it now, his hands shaking slightly. It wasn't loaded, but whoever was outside didn't need to know that. He moved to the window and peered through the curtain. Moonlight cast shadows across the yard. For a moment he saw nothing, then movement near the barn. A figure, definitely a person, moving carefully through the darkness. Harold's first instinct was to call the sheriff. His second was to wonder what he'd tell them. "Someone's snooping around my property, where I just found millions of dollars worth of treasure I haven't reported yet." He watched as the figure moved toward the excavation site, barely visible under the plywood covering. They crouched there for several minutes, examining it. Harold couldn't see details, couldn't tell if it was a man or woman, young or old, just a shape in the darkness. Then the figure stood and moved quickly back toward the road. Harold heard a car engine start in the distance, saw no headlights. Whoever it was had parked down the road and walked up. Harold stood at the window for another hour, rifle in hand, watching. But the intruder didn't return. In the morning, he examined the excavation site. The plywood had been moved slightly, like someone tried to lift it, but found it too heavy with the concrete blocks. Boot prints marked the dirt around it. Not Harold's boots. These were smaller, different tread. "We're not safe here," Margaret said when he showed her. She'd been quiet all morning, withdrawn. "We need security," Harold said. "Cameras, maybe. Lights." "With what money?" Margaret asked. Then she laughed, a harsh sound. "Oh, wait. We have plenty. We just can't spend it yet." Harold understood her frustration. They were sitting on a fortune but still living like paupers because the legal process moved slowly and they couldn't access the funds without raising red flags. Patterson had said months. They'd been at this a week. It felt like a lifetime. On Saturday afternoon, a Mercedes pulled up the driveway. Harold watched from the window as Daniel got out, followed by his wife Jessica. They were early, not due until Sunday. Or maybe Harold had mixed up the days after putting them off. Either way, his oldest son was here. Daniel looked prosperous. His hair was perfectly cut, his clothes expensive casual. Jessica wore sunglasses that probably cost more than Harold's monthly pension. They looked around the property with expressions Harold couldn't quite read. Pity? Assessment? Calculation? Harold opened the door before they could knock. "Daniel, Jessica, didn't expect you today." "Surprise," Daniel said, smiling that professional smile he used with clients. "Thought we'd come a day early, spend more time with you guys." Margaret appeared behind Harold, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Daniel, sweetheart, this is unexpected." They exchanged hugs that felt stiff and formal. Inside, Jessica looked around the small house with barely concealed distaste. She'd always made it clear she found the farmhouse quaint at best, depressing at worst. "So," Daniel said once they were seated in the living room, Harold and Margaret on the couch, Daniel and Jessica in the old recliners. "Michael mentioned you've been doing some work around here." Harold tensed. "Michael mentioned that, did he?" "Yeah. Said you told him Mom wasn't feeling well and you had property stuff to handle. Everything okay?" "Everything's fine," Harold said carefully. Daniel glanced at Jessica, then back to his parents. "Because if you're having trouble maintaining this place, there are options. Assisted living facilities, senior communities, places where you wouldn't have to worry about repairs and upkeep." Margaret's jaw tightened. "We're not going to a home, Daniel." "I'm not suggesting a home, Mom. I'm talking about active senior communities, nice places, safe places." He paused. "Or you could sell. The property's worth what, 200,000? 250? You could split that between, I don't know, relocating somewhere easier and helping out your kids. Rachel's struggling with her business. Michael's child support is killing him. And I could use capital for an investment opportunity." Harold stared at his son. This was why he'd come, not to visit, not to check on his aging parents, to pitch them on selling their property, so he could get a cut of the proceeds. "We're not selling," Harold said quietly. Daniel's smile thinned. "Dad, be realistic. You're 78. Mom's 76. This place is falling apart. The roof leaks. The foundation's cracked. You can't keep this up forever." "We're managing," Margaret said. "Are you?" Jessica spoke for the first time, her voice sharp. "Because from what we've heard, you've been digging holes in the backyard. The county assessor came out. People are talking." So that was it. They'd heard about the assessor's visit. Probably heard exaggerated versions, small-town rumors growing with each telling. "We found an old root cellar," Harold said. "Thought it might be interesting." "Interesting?" Daniel leaned forward. "Dad, if you found something on this property, something valuable, we need to know. We're family. We have a right to know what's going on." Harold felt anger building, hot and sharp. "You have a right. You've called maybe 4 times this year, Rachel 3, Michael barely more. You haven't visited in 7 years, but now you have rights?" Daniel's face reddened. "That's not fair. We've been busy. We have lives, careers, responsibilities." "So did we," Margaret said quietly. "When we were raising you, when we were paying for your college, helping with your weddings, babysitting your children, we had responsibilities too, but we showed up." The room went silent. Jessica shifted uncomfortably. Daniel opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "Look," he said finally, "I didn't come here to fight. I came because I'm worried. You're both getting older. You need help. And if there's something going on with this property, some kind of discovery or development opportunity, we should discuss it as a family." "There's nothing to discuss," Harold said. "This is our property, our home, and it will stay that way." Daniel stood abruptly. "Fine, be stubborn, but when you can't handle this place anymore, when you need help, don't expect us to drop everything." "We never did," Margaret said softly. "We never expected anything." Daniel and Jessica left 15 minutes later, their visit cutting short before it really began. Harold watched the Mercedes disappear down the driveway and felt something break inside his chest. Not his heart, not exactly, something else. The last thread of hope that his children might actually care about him and Margaret for themselves, not for what they might inherit. Margaret cried that night, not loud, not dramatic, just quiet tears that soaked into her pillow. Harold held her and said nothing because there was nothing to say. Their children had shown their true faces, and those faces were ugly with greed and entitlement. Sunday brought Rachel. Monday brought Michael. Each visit followed the same pattern. Casual concern masking transparent interest in the property. Questions about what they'd found. Suggestions about selling, downsizing, helping out the kids who suddenly needed financial assistance. Harold turned them all away with variations of the same answer. "There's nothing to tell you. The property is ours. We're not selling." But each visit wore on him. By Tuesday, he felt hollowed out, exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical labor. Margaret wasn't eating. She'd gone pale and withdrawn, barely speaking except to answer direct questions. Patterson called Wednesday morning with good news. The first appraisals were in. The gold alone was worth over $40 million. The bearer bonds, if they could be redeemed, were worth another $60 million. They hadn't even gotten to the art, jewelry, or rare stamps yet. "You're looking at well over $100 million, Patterson said. "Possibly closer to $200 million once everything's authenticated and appraised. Congratulations, Mr. Mitchell. You're a very wealthy man." Harold should have felt elated. Instead, he felt sick. That afternoon, a man in an expensive suit appeared at the door. He introduced himself as Thomas Werner, a private collector specializing in Prohibition-era artifacts and art. "I heard," Werner said carefully, "that you might have come across some items of historical interest. I'm prepared to offer very competitive prices for the right pieces. Cash immediate, no questions asked." Harold stared at him. Who told you that? Verna smiled. Word travels in certain circles. I've been searching for Cornelius Thornton's collection for 30 years. If you have it, I want it. Get off my property, Harold said. Verna's smile faded. Don't be foolish, Mr. Mitchell. You're in over your head. There are people who'll offer far less than me, people who won't be as polite. Harold closed the door in his face, but his hands shook as he turned the lock. Thursday evening, as the sun set and shadows stretched across the farmhouse, Harold felt pain blossom in his chest. Sharp, radiating, stealing his breath. He gripped the kitchen counter, gasping. "Harold?" Margaret's voice came from far away. "Can't breathe," he managed. Margaret was beside him instantly, phone in hand, dialing 911. Harold slid to the floor, the pain crushing him. He thought about the vault beneath their feet, about the fortune they'd found, about children who'd abandoned them until money entered the picture. He thought about Margaret and how she'd be alone if he died now. "Hold on," Margaret was saying, her voice breaking. "Please hold on." The ambulance arrived 15 minutes later. Paramedics loaded Harold onto a stretcher while Margaret grabbed her purse with shaking hands. As they wheeled him past the living room, Harold saw the photos on the mantel. Daniel, Rachel, Michael, smiling faces frozen in time, back when they'd still been a family, back before his children had forgotten how to love without conditions. The emergency room at Millbrook General was small but competent. Doctors ran tests, hooked Harold up to monitors, gave him medications that made the pain recede. Margaret sat beside his bed holding his hand, her face drawn. "Stress-induced angina," the doctor said. "Not a heart attack, but a warning. You need rest, Mr. Mitchell. Whatever's causing you stress, you need to address it." Harold looked at Margaret. She looked back. They both knew what was causing the stress. The vault, the money, the children circling like vultures, the strangers showing up, the feeling of being watched, targeted, pressured from all sides. They'd found a fortune, but the fortune was killing them. That night, in the hospital room with machines beeping softly and Margaret dozing in the chair beside him, Harold made a decision. They couldn't keep living like this. They couldn't wait months for legal processes while their children manipulated and strangers threatened and his own body betrayed him. They needed to act, and they needed to act fast. Harold left the hospital Friday morning against medical advice. The doctor wanted to keep him another day for observation, but Harold refused. He had things to do, decisions to make, and lying in a hospital bed wasn't going to change anything. Margaret drove them home in silence. The farmhouse looked different when they pulled up, smaller somehow, more vulnerable. Harold noticed fresh tire tracks in the driveway that weren't theirs. More visitors while they'd been gone. Inside, they found a note tucked into the screen door. Harold unfolded it with stiff fingers. The handwriting was unfamiliar. "Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell, we need to talk about your discovery. I represent parties with legitimate interest in the Thornton estate. Please contact me at your earliest convenience." A phone number followed, no signature. Harold crumpled the note and tossed it in the trash. Margaret watched him, her expression unreadable. "We can't keep doing this," she said softly. "I know. Then what do we do?" Harold lowered himself into a kitchen chair, feeling every one of his 78 years. "We take control, stop reacting and start acting." He called Patterson that afternoon. The lawyer answered on the second ring. "I need you to accelerate everything," Harold said. "I don't care what it costs. Hire more appraisers, file the paperwork now, whatever needs doing. I want this resolved in weeks, not months." Patterson was quiet for a moment. "That's going to be expensive, Mr. Mitchell. Rush fees, premium rates for authentication experts." "I understand, but I'm not waiting. Either we move fast or we're going to lose control of this entirely." "There's something else you should know," Patterson said carefully. "I've had 3 inquiries this week from other attorneys claiming to represent potential heirs to the Thornton estate. All pretty transparent attempts to stake claims, but they'll tie this up in court if they can." Harold's jaw tightened. Can they win? Unlikely, but they can delay, cost you time and money fighting them. Then we fight, Harold said. Just get it done. Over the next week, their property became a circus. Patterson brought in a team of experts, numismatists for the coins, art historians for the paintings, a gemologist for the jewelry. Each one descended into the vault with cases of equipment and emerged hours later with detailed reports. The Renoir was authentic, worth $12 million at auction. 2 other paintings were confirmed as works by minor Impressionist masters, worth several million each. The jewelry collection was appraised at $8 million, the rare stamps $15 million. The gold bars, at current market prices, totaled $43 million, and the bearer bonds. Those took longest to verify. Patterson worked with Federal Treasury experts, tracking serial numbers, confirming they'd never been redeemed. By the end of the week, they had confirmation. $87 million in bearer bonds, still valid, still redeemable. The total came to $263 million. Harold sat at his kitchen table listening to Patterson read the final figures and felt nothing. The numbers were too large, too abstract. They didn't feel real. There's the matter of taxes, Patterson continued. Federal and state combined, you're looking at roughly 40%. That leaves you with approximately $158 million after taxes. $158 million. Harold had worked his entire life and never made more than $40,000 in any single year. Now he was facing a fortune that dwarfed anything he could have imagined. What do we do with it? He asked quietly. Patterson hesitated. That's not really my area, Mr. Mitchell, but I'd suggest a financial advisor, estate planning, trusts for your children if you choose. Harold looked at Margaret. She sat across from him, hands folded on the table, her face expressionless. They'd barely discussed the children since the hospital, barely discussed anything except logistics and paperwork. I need some time, Harold said, to think about this. That night, Harold couldn't sleep again. He stood at the window looking out over the property. Moonlight painted everything silver and shadow. Somewhere beneath his feet, the vault sat open, mostly empty now. The experts had photographed and catalogued everything. Some items had been moved to secure storage for eventual auction. The gold bars alone filled 2 safety deposit boxes at the bank in Clearwater. He thought about his children, about Daniel's pitch to sell the property and split the proceeds, about Rachel's sudden interest in their finances, about Michael's convenient timing, calling the same day they'd opened the vault. They'd shown their true nature. When Harold and Margaret had nothing, when they were struggling, forgotten, alone, their children couldn't be bothered. But the moment money entered the picture, suddenly they were concerned. Suddenly they were family. Margaret appeared beside him, wrapped in her bathrobe. She looked smaller lately, diminished. The stress had carved years into her face. I've been thinking, she said quietly, about what we should do. Harold waited. I don't want to give them anything, Margaret continued, her voice barely above a whisper. Is that terrible? Does that make me a bad mother? Harold reached for her hand. No, it makes you human. They abandoned us, Harold. For years they abandoned us. And the only reason they came back was money, not love, not concern, just greed. Tears tracked down her cheeks. Harold pulled her close, holding her as she cried against his shoulder. All the grief they'd been carrying, all the loneliness and hurt and betrayal, it poured out in those tears. When she finally quieted, Harold spoke. We don't owe them anything. Legally, morally, any way you look at it, this fortune is ours. What we do with it is our choice. But they're our children, Margaret said. Even if they don't act like it, they're still our children. Harold nodded slowly. He understood. Cutting them off completely felt like admitting defeat, like acknowledging the family was truly broken beyond repair. So we make a decision, he said. not based on what they want or what they expect, based on what's right, what we can live with. They spent the weekend talking, really talking, for the first time in years. Not about bills or repairs or things falling apart. About dreams, about purpose, about what mattered when you reached the end of your life and looked back. Margaret admitted she'd stopped dreaming a long time ago. Stopped imagining anything beyond survival. Harold confessed he'd felt invisible, like the world had forgotten he existed and was just waiting for him to die. But now they had options. Now they had power. The question was what to do with it. Monday morning, Harold called a family meeting. He left messages for all 3 children. "We need to talk, all of us. Saturday at noon. It's important." The responses came within hours. Daniel could make it. Rachel would fly in Friday night. Michael would be there. All of them suddenly available, suddenly eager. Harold and Margaret spent the week preparing. They met with financial advisors, estate attorneys, tax specialists. They drafted documents, made decisions, built a structure for what came next. By Friday evening, they were ready. Saturday dawned clear and cold. Frost edged the grass in the morning. Harold made coffee and eggs while Margaret set the dining room table. They'd cleaned the house thoroughly, not because their children deserved it, but because they deserved to feel pride in their home one last time before everything changed. Daniel arrived first at 11:45, punctual as always. His Mercedes looked out of place next to Harold's ancient pickup truck. Jessica wasn't with him this time. He came alone, his expression carefully neutral. Rachel's rental car pulled up at 11:52. She wore yoga pants and an expensive jacket, her hair pulled back in a ponytail. She hugged Margaret with that same rehearsed embrace, air kisses that touched nothing. Michael arrived at exactly noon in his Toyota. He looked nervous, fidgeting with his keys. He'd always been the most transparent of the 3 children, his emotions written across his face. They gathered in the living room. Harold and Margaret sat together on the couch. Their 3 children arranged themselves across from them, Daniel in the recliner, Rachel and Michael on folding chairs Harold had brought in from the basement. The room felt smaller with 5 people in it, claustrophobic. Harold could hear the old clock on the mantel ticking, counting seconds like heartbeats. "Thank you for coming," Harold began. His voice was steady, though his hands trembled slightly. "Your mother and I have something to tell you." He could see them lean forward, expectancy in their faces. They thought this was it, the moment they'd inherit a fortune, the payoff for showing up. 3 weeks ago, Harold continued, I noticed the ground settling near our old root cellar. When I investigated, I found something buried beneath our property, an underground structure built in the 1920s by a bootlegger named Cornelius Thornton. Daniel's eyes widened slightly. Rachel sat perfectly still. Michael glanced between his siblings. Inside that structure was a vault, and inside that vault was a fortune. Gold, bearer bonds, art, jewelry, rare collectibles. It's been authenticated and appraised. The total value is $263 million. The room exploded. Daniel stood up. $263 million. Are you serious? Rachel's hand went to her mouth. Oh my God! Michael just stared, his face pale. After taxes, Harold continued, raising his voice slightly, we'll have approximately $158 million. That's incredible, Daniel said, his professional composure cracking. Dad, Mum, this is life-changing, for all of us. We need to talk about estate planning, trusts, distribution. I can put you in touch with my financial people in Boston. We've already handled that, Harold said quietly. The room went silent again. What do you mean? Rachel asked. Margaret spoke for the first time. We've spent this week making decisions about what to do with the money, about what matters to us, about legacy. Okay, Daniel said slowly, sitting back down. And? Harold took a breath. This was the moment, the one they'd rehearsed, prepared for, but saying the words out loud still felt like stepping off a cliff. We're not giving you the money, Harold said. The words hung in the air like smoke. Excuse me? Daniel's voice had gone cold. We're not giving you the fortune, Harold repeated. Not most of it. Not the way you're expecting. Michael found his voice. Dad, what are you talking about? We're your children. We're family. Are we? Margaret asked softly. Because for the last 7 years we haven't felt like family. We've felt forgotten. That's not fair, Rachel protested. We've been busy. We have lives, careers, families of our own. So did we, Harold said. When you were growing up, when we were working 2 jobs to pay for your college, when we were helping with down payments on your houses, babysitting your kids, showing up for every graduation and wedding and birthday. We were busy too, but we made time. Daniel's face had reddened. This is what this is about. You're punishing us because we didn't call enough. No, Margaret said, her voice breaking. We're not punishing you. We're just acknowledging reality. You didn't want to be part of our lives when we had nothing. You only came back when you heard we might have something valuable. That's not true, Michael said, but his voice lacked conviction. Isn't it? Harold asked. Michael, you called the same day we opened the vault, after 2 months of silence. Rachel, you started asking about our finances within days. Daniel, you pitched us on selling the property so you could get investment capital. You all showed up the moment you thought there was money involved. Because we were concerned, Rachel said. Were you? Margaret's eyes were wet. Were you concerned when the furnace died last winter and we nearly froze? Were you concerned when your father needed surgery we couldn't afford? Were you concerned during the hundreds of days we sat alone in this house waiting for the phone to ring? Rachel looked away. Daniel's jaw was clenched so tight Harold could see the muscles jumping. Michael just stared at the floor. We're not cutting you off completely, Harold said. We've set up trust funds for your children, our grandchildren, $50,000 each for education. They'll get that when they turn 18. 50,000? Daniel's voice dripped with disbelief. Out of 158 million? Yes, Harold said firmly. And we're giving each of you $100,000. Enough to help if you need it, but not enough to change who you are. This is insane, Daniel stood again. We're talking about over $150 million. You're going to give us each $100,000 and that's it? What are you doing with the rest? Rachel demanded. Margaret answered. We're creating a foundation, the Millbrook Community Foundation, dedicated to helping seniors in need, affordable housing for the elderly, programs to keep families connected, medical assistance, meal delivery, everything we wish had existed for us. You're giving it away, Daniel said flatly. You're giving our inheritance to strangers. It was never your inheritance, Harold said, his voice hardening. This fortune was hidden for 90 years. It could have stayed hidden forever. We found it on our property. It's ours to do with as we choose. This is because of what I said last weekend, isn't it? Daniel's face was flushed now, angry. Because I suggested you sell the property. Because I was being practical. No, Margaret said. This is because of 7 years of silence. 7 years of feeling like we didn't matter. 7 years of waiting for children who never came. Michael finally spoke, his voice small. We should have been better. I know that. I'm sorry. But this feels like you're punishing us forever for mistakes we can still fix. Harold felt something shift in his chest. Michael sounded sincere. Young still, despite being 46. Maybe there was hope there, maybe not. But the decision was made. This isn't punishment, Harold said gently. This is us choosing to do something that matters. We don't have many years left. We want those years to mean something. We want to help people like us, people who've been forgotten. So that's it? Rachel's voice was sharp. We drove all the way here for you to tell us we're getting essentially nothing while you give millions to strangers. Yes, Margaret said simply. Daniel grabbed his keys from the side table. This is a mistake. You're old. You're not thinking clearly. When you realize what you're doing, when you need help, don't call me." He stormed out. They heard his Mercedes roar to life, tires spitting gravel as he peeled down the driveway. Rachel stood more slowly. "I can't believe you're doing this," she said, her voice shaking. "I can't believe my own parents care more about their image than their own children." "This isn't about image," Harold said. "This is about doing what's right." "Right?" Rachel laughed bitterly. "You're hurting your own family. That's what's right to you?" She left without another word. Her rental car disappeared down the same driveway minutes later. Michael remained seated. He looked at his parents with an expression Harold couldn't quite read. Hurt? Yes. Anger, maybe. But something else, too. Understanding, perhaps. Or at least the beginning of it. "I'm sorry," Michael said finally, "for not being there. For all the times I should have called and didn't. For making you feel forgotten." He paused. "I don't agree with what you're doing. I think we could have found a middle ground. But I understand why you're doing it." He stood and moved toward them. Harold tensed, unsure. But Michael just bent and hugged his mother, then his father. Not the stiff, obligatory embraces from before. Real hugs. "I'll try to be better," Michael said. "Not because of money. Just because I should have been all along." Then he left too, more quietly than his siblings. Harold and Margaret sat alone in the living room. The house settled around them with its familiar creaks and groans. Outside, autumn wind rattled the windows. "Did we do the right thing?" Margaret asked. Harold took her hand. "I think so. Or at least the thing we can live with." Over the following weeks, the foundation took shape. Patterson handled the legal framework. Financial advisors structured the endowment to generate sustainable income. Harold and Margaret worked with local social workers and community organizers to identify needs. The response was overwhelming. Seniors who'd been struggling in silence came forward. People who couldn't afford medication. Widows living in houses too big to maintain but too meaningful to leave. Elderly couples choosing between heating and eating. The problems Harold and Margaret had faced weren't unique. They were universal, just invisible until someone bothered to look. The foundation started small. They funded a Meals on Wheels program, provided grants for home repairs, covered medical copays for seniors whose insurance wasn't enough. They partnered with the hospital to offer free transportation for elderly patients, created a visiting program matching volunteers with isolated seniors. Word spread beyond Millbrook. The story made regional news. Elderly couple finds fortune, gives it away to help others like them. Journalists wanted interviews. Harold declined most of them. This wasn't about publicity. But some stories he allowed because they helped. A piece in the state paper brought donations from others wanting to support the foundation. A segment on the evening news connected them with experts in senior care. Slowly, a network formed. By Thanksgiving, 3 months after opening the vault, the foundation had helped over 200 families. By Christmas, that number had doubled. Harold and Margaret visited many of them personally. They heard stories of desperation turned to hope, of seniors who'd been contemplating suicide now finding reasons to keep going, of families reconnecting because basic needs were met and stress reduced. One woman, Clara, 82 years old, cried when the foundation paid for repairs to her roof. "I thought I'd die in that house with water dripping on my bed," she said. "I couldn't ask my kids for help. They have their own problems. I just didn't know where to turn." Harold knew that feeling. The isolation, the pride that kept you from asking, the slow surrender to circumstances beyond your control. "You don't have to feel that way anymore," he told her. The old farmhouse got repaired too. Not lavishly, but properly. New roof, new furnace, foundation stabilized. Harold and Margaret could have moved to a mansion. Instead, they stayed exactly where they were, in the home they'd raised their children in, on the land that had given them a second chance. The vault beneath their feet became a small museum. They kept it mostly as they'd found it, preserving the underground rooms as historical artifacts. Local schools brought students for tours. Harold would lead them down those stone steps and tell them about Cornelius Thornton, about Prohibition, about how history sometimes hides in unexpected places. The lesson, he'd tell the kids, isn't just about finding treasure. It's about what you do with what you find, about using good fortune to create more good fortune for others. Daniel never called. Harold wasn't surprised. His oldest son had made his feelings clear. Maybe someday that would change. Maybe not. Harold had made peace with it. Rachel sent a card at Christmas. Inside was a brief note. Still processing everything. Need more time. Harold tucked it into his wallet. It was something. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, but acknowledgement. A door not entirely closed. Michael surprised them both. He started calling weekly. Short conversations at first, awkward. But gradually they lengthened. He told them about his kids, his struggles with his ex-wife, his job stress. He asked about the foundation, seemed genuinely interested. By January, he was visiting monthly. One Saturday in February, Michael showed up with his 2 children, Emma, 14, and Lucas, 11. The grandchildren, Harold and Margaret, barely knew. "I want them to understand," Michael said, "what you're doing, why it matters." Harold gave them a tour of the underground rooms, showed them the vault, explained the history. Emma took photos on her phone. Lucas asked a dozen questions about bootleggers and secret passages. Afterward, they had lunch in the farmhouse. Margaret had made pot roast, the same meal she'd made 7 years ago for the last family gathering. This time, phones stayed off the table. They talked, really talked. Lucas wanted to know about Harold's childhood. Emma asked Margaret about raising kids during harder times. It wasn't perfect. One afternoon didn't erase years of absence, but it was a beginning. As they were leaving, Michael pulled Harold aside. "I've been thinking about what you said, about being there for people, about what matters." He paused. "I want to volunteer for the foundation. I'm an accountant. I could help with bookkeeping, financial oversight, if you'd want that." Harold felt his throat tighten. Yeah, we'd want that." Spring came to Millbrook with the kind of gentle warmth that made everything feel possible. Harold turned 79 in March. Margaret would be 77 in June. They celebrated quietly, just the 2 of them, with a small cake and coffee on the porch. They watched the sun set over their 12 acres. The land looked different now, not neglected or overwhelming, just peaceful. They'd hired a local teenager to help with basic maintenance. The barn had been partially restored. The old tractor still sat beside it, but now it was more monument than eyesore. "Do you regret it?" Margaret asked. "Giving away the money?" Harold thought about it honestly. They could have kept more, could have lived in luxury, traveled the world, bought everything they'd ever wanted. "No," he said. "We have enough. We always did. We just didn't realize it." The foundation continued growing. By summer, they'd expanded to 3 counties. Other communities wanted to replicate the model. Harold and Margaret shared everything they'd learned, helped others start similar programs. The ripple effect spread further than they'd imagined possible. They received letters weekly, thank you notes from seniors whose lives had been touched by the foundation. Photos of repaired homes, medical bills paid, families reunited. Each one reminded Harold why they'd made their choice. One letter came from a man in his 50s. "You helped my mother," he wrote. "She was too proud to ask me for help, too ashamed to admit she was struggling. Your foundation gave her dignity along with assistance. It also showed me I needed to pay more attention. I visit her every week now. Thank you for the wake-up call." Harold showed the letter to Margaret. "This is what we wanted," he said. not just helping seniors, but reconnecting families, reminding people to look out for each other. By autumn, 1 year after finding the vault, the foundation had distributed over $20 million in assistance and services. The endowment was structured to continue indefinitely, generating enough income to sustain operations for decades, maybe centuries. Harold and Margaret's names were on the foundation, but they insisted on staying out of the spotlight. They wanted the work to speak for itself. One October afternoon, almost exactly a year after opening that hatch, Harold stood at the excavation site. They'd built a proper structure over it now, a small building with climate control to protect the underground rooms. A historical marker explained the site's significance. He descended those stone steps one more time, his knees protesting but manageable. The rooms looked different, lit by modern lights, preserved but lifeless somehow. The desk where he'd first found Cornelius Thornton's journal sat empty now, the papers archived in a local historical society. He entered the vault. Empty shelves lined the walls. All the treasure had been moved, sold, distributed in various forms. What remained was just space, stone and steel and silence. Harold ran his hand along the cold wall and thought about Cornelius. The man had died 90 years ago trying to protect his fortune. He'd built this elaborate structure, hidden his wealth, taken his secrets to the grave. And for what? So it could sit undiscovered for 9 decades while the world forgot he ever existed. Or maybe Cornelius had been waiting for the right people to find it, waiting for someone who would use it the way Harold and Margaret had, not for themselves but for others. Harold liked to think that, liked to imagine Cornelius somewhere watching, satisfied that his fortune had finally fulfilled a purpose he never could have anticipated. Upstairs, Margaret was waiting. They'd planned a quiet dinner, just the two of them. Maybe a movie later. Their lives had become simple again, but by choice this time, not necessity. As Harold climbed back up into the afternoon light, he thought about legacy, about what you leave behind. Cornelius had left money. Daniel would probably leave money too when his time came. Buildings with names on them, investments and portfolios. But Harold and Margaret were leaving something different. Changed lives, restored dignity, communities strengthened, families reconnected. You couldn't put that in a vault, couldn't hide it underground or protect it with steel doors. It lived in the world, growing, spreading, touching people they'd never meet. That evening, sitting on the porch with Margaret, watching the autumn stars emerge, Harold felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not wealth, not security, not even happiness exactly. Peace. The phone rang inside. Harold could hear it through the open window. They looked at each other, half smiling. It rang several times before one of them moved to answer it. It was Michael, calling for his weekly check-in. They talked for 20 minutes, about Emma's algebra struggles, about Lucas's soccer team, about Michael's idea for expanding the Foundation's volunteer program. Before hanging up, Michael said something he'd never said before. "I love you guys, both of you. I should say that more." "We love you too," Harold said, his voice rough. After the call ended, Harold returned to the porch. Margaret had made tea, 2 mugs steaming in the cool air. "Michael?" she asked. "Yeah." They sat in comfortable silence. Somewhere in the distance a dog barked. Wind rustled through the oaks. The porch swing creaked gently as they rocked. Harold thought about the journey they'd taken, from forgotten elderly couples struggling to survive, to finding an impossible fortune, to giving most of it away. People probably thought they were crazy. Daniel certainly did. Rachel too. Maybe even some of the Foundation's beneficiaries questioned their choices. But sitting here with Margaret, their home secure, their purpose clear, their days meaningful, Harold knew they'd done exactly right. "No regrets?" Margaret asked, as if reading his mind. "Not one," Harold said. The years that followed proved their choice wise. The Foundation became a model for elderly assistance programs nationwide. Other philanthropists started similar initiatives. Policymakers cited it in debates about senior care. But Harold and Margaret stayed humble, stayed local, stayed focused on the work. They aged, of course. Bodies grew weaker. Harold needed a cane by 80. Margaret's arthritis worsened. But they had help now. Not just Michael, though he remained involved. A whole community that had been touched by their generosity showed up. People mowed their lawn, brought meals, checked in regularly. The isolation that had defined their 70s didn't exist in their 80s. They were surrounded, embraced, part of something larger than themselves. Daniel never reconciled. He sent a card when Harold turned 85, stiff, formal, no personal message beyond a printed greeting. Harold added it to the box where he kept such things, evidence that his son still existed, even if they'd never truly connect again. Rachel did reconcile eventually. It took 5 years. She showed up one Thanksgiving unannounced, alone, and asked if she could join them for dinner. They'd said yes. She'd cried while eating Margaret's stuffing, apologized for being selfish, for letting money poison their relationship, for taking so long to understand. "I watch what you're doing with the foundation," she said. "I see the lives you've changed, and I realize how small I was being, how small I still am sometimes." Forgiveness didn't come instantly, but it came. Slowly, over shared meals and tentative conversations. By the time Harold turned 86, Rachel was visiting twice a year. Not as much as Michael, but genuine when she came. The grandchildren grew. Some stayed distant, shaped by their parents' bitterness. But others sought out Harold and Margaret. Emma studied social work in college, inspired by her grandparents' foundation. Lucas volunteered there during summers. Other grandchildren, once strangers, became friends. Harold's health declined gradually. A stroke at 87 left him weaker but still present. Margaret nursed him with the same fierce devotion she'd shown for 63 years of marriage. They'd made it past 60 years, past 65. Each anniversary felt like victory. One morning in late spring, Harold woke in their bedroom, the same room where they'd slept for decades. Sunlight streamed through windows that no longer leaked. Margaret lay beside him, her breathing soft and steady. He thought about the vault beneath them, about the fortune they'd found and given away, about Cornelius Thornton and the strange path that had led a bootlegger's treasure to become a blessing for thousands of people. He thought about his children. The pain of Daniel's rejection had dulled but never disappeared. Rachel's reconciliation had healed some wounds. Michael's transformation from absent son to devoted family man felt like a gift he hadn't dared expect. But most of all, Harold thought about Margaret, his partner through everything, the woman who'd stood beside him through poverty, discovery, decision, consequence, who'd never wavered in supporting their choice to give the money away, even when it would have been easier to keep it. "You awake?" Margaret's voice came soft beside him. "Yeah." "Thinking about the vault?" He smiled. She always knew. "Thinking about everything, about how we got here." Margaret turned to face him. They were old now, truly old. Her face was mapped with wrinkles, her hands spotted and thin. But her eyes were the same eyes he'd fallen in love with 63 years ago. "Do you think we made a difference?" she asked. Harold thought about the letters they'd received, thousands of them now, about the families helped, the lives saved, the ripple effects spreading outward in ways they'd never fully know. "Yeah," he said, "I think we did." They lay together in comfortable silence as morning light filled the room. Outside, birds sang. Somewhere nearby, a volunteer from the foundation was probably delivering meals to a senior who needed them. In town, the foundation's office was opening for another day of helping people who'd been forgotten. Harold and Margaret had been forgotten once, abandoned by their children, left to struggle alone. But finding that vault had given them a choice, and they'd chosen not bitterness, not revenge, not even comfort for themselves. They'd chosen purpose, legacy, the kind of wealth that multiplied instead of divided. Anyone can change the world if they're stubborn enough to stand their ground and brave enough to choose purpose over comfort. Harold Mitchell passed away quietly in his sleep at age 89. Margaret followed 16 months later at 88. They were buried side by side in the Millbrook Cemetery, their shared headstone simple and understated. But their legacy lived on. The foundation they'd created continued its work, now run by a board that included Michael Mitchell, several grandchildren, and community members whose lives had been touched by Harold and Margaret's generosity. The underground vault beneath their property became a permanent historical site. Thousands visited each year, touring the bootleggers' hideout and learning about the elderly couple who'd found a fortune and given it away. In the visitors' center, a plaque told their story. But the words that mattered most were carved on a smaller marker at the vault entrance, Harold's own words from an interview years earlier. "We were abandoned by our children and forgotten by the world. But beneath the ground where we'd given up hope, we found not just treasure but purpose. We learned that the greatest wealth isn't what you keep, but what you give away. We learned that family isn't always blood, but the people who show up when you need them. And we learned that it's never too late to matter, to make a difference, to leave the world better than you found it." The Mitchell farmhouse remained standing, preserved as part of the historical site. Visitors could walk through the rooms where Harold and Margaret had lived, see the photos on the walls, imagine the lonely years before everything changed. But they could also see what came after. The foundation offices, the community center built with Mitchell funding, the affordable senior housing, the meal programs, the visiting services, the legacy that touched thousands of lives and would continue touching thousands more, because Harold and Margaret Mitchell hadn't just found buried treasure. They'd found something far more valuable, the chance to transform their pain into purpose, their abandonment into action, their final years into something that mattered, and in the end, that meant more than any fortune hidden in a vault. The end. Up next, 2 more powerful stories are waiting for you. Click to keep discovering stories of hope, heart, and second chances. And don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe it's never too late to change your legacy and that true wealth is measured in lives touched, not dollars counted.